There is a traditional Bible story of the first Christmas that we have been taught that is wrong on almost all points, and it has distorted both history and the underlying message of the story. Now that's a really strong statement, but if you want to hear the real story of the first Christmas that possibly you've never heard before, welcome to Dechurched Christmas Special podcast. Here's the story that's wrong. Mary is heavily pregnant when she arrives in Bethlehem. She goes into labor within seconds of getting off the donkey. There is no space at the inn. The birth is away from human eyes in a stable because after all it's too holy for human eyes. And immediately afterwards the Holy Family have to flee to Egypt. Now at every point this is not accurate. Yeah, that's what I said. I want to uncover the real story of Christmas told in Luke's Gospel. And we will find a Jesus who is welcomed by the hospitality of his hometown, who is amongst the poor, and who eventually faces, like many poor people do, the cruelty and wickedness of those in power. But when he does, he becomes one in whom we can identify our own sense of vulnerability. This is Dechurched. Welcome. Our main source for our traditional Christmas story is the book of Luke, chapters 1 to 2, and the beginning of Matthew. The challenge for interpreters is having an understanding of a 2,000-year-old Greek language, first century Palestinian culture, and first century archaeology. And when this comes into conflict with a competing church tradition of how the Christmas story goes, it gets really tricky. Let's take each of the points we mentioned in turn. Mary is heavily pregnant when she arrives. She goes into labor within seconds of getting off the donkey. That's wrong. There is no evidence for this in most translations. The Greek gives no indication that the baby is ready to pop out in a hurry. Many scholars argue that she could have been in Bethlehem for some time before the child is born. Next statement, there is no space at the inn. Here is a big mistake. The word for inn is not used in this passage. Luke has a word for inn that he uses in the story of the Good Samaritan. It's not used in the Christmas narrative. And anyway, Bethlehem was too small a hamlet or town or village to have an inn. The word that is used here is the word Luke uses later in his gospel for an upper room. A bit like a spare room or a guest room. It could even be translated as the hospitality room. That's how important hospitality was and is in the Middle East. Even the poorest houses had space set aside for hospitality. So there's no room in the spare room. So they laid the baby in a manger. What's that all about? How does that work? Palestinian archaeology over the last 150 years has shown that peasant homes had a raised living, eating and sleeping area with an upstairs spare room. This spare room was almost exclusively set aside for visitors. Okay, but where's the manger? At a lower level than the living area, a few feet lower, would be an area for the animals to be brought into at night. Middle Eastern peasants lived in close proximity to their animals. So you've got an upper floor, a living, eating and sleeping area on a lower level, and then lower still, an animal area. And what archaeologists have found is that at the border between the animal area and the living area would be, guess what? A manger. So here's the story. There's no room in the spare room. It wouldn't occur to Luke's readers that the couple would be turned away, such was the high value of hospitality, but they would ask, okay, so what happened to the baby? And Luke instinctively answers, so they laid the baby in a manger. And that would of course make sense given the layout of peasant homes. So what just happened to our Christmas story? Joseph and Mary are welcomed in their hometown. They're not turned aside even if conditions are cramped. That fits with the whole of Luke's narrative so far of the poor welcoming the Messiah. After a little time, Jesus is born there among the poor. His bed is a manger, but that's not in a stable. Mangers were in houses. Animal husbandry by Middle Eastern peasants didn't typically have stables away from humans. That's more a Western European idea. And the idea of the stable for the holy birth was also a way for the Western church to emphasize the separateness and holiness of the birth of Jesus, away from mere mortals. Only Saint Joseph and Saint Mary could be there, no one else. Luke has none of that. Jesus' birth is a community event in his hometown and in a peasant home. And just because it's among the nitty-gritty of life doesn't make it less holy. This is the real Jewish peasant Jesus, born in the place of prophecy, Bethlehem, born in real-life circumstances familiar to Luke's readers. This Jesus is not remote or being born into a Christmassy kind of tableau scene with glowing halos. And because it is so earthed and ordinary, it speaks of a real time and a real life in a real place. Not some mystical or hallowed event airbrushed to seem remote or disconnected from the real world. And while there are transcendent, wondrous parts to the story, this story reflects a very real birth. So real, in fact, Jesus could have been killed by Herod's troops, who later come to kill all the newborns in Bethlehem who are under 2 years old. And everything we know about Herod says this is well within the range of normal behavior for him. Why under 2 years? Because newborn Jesus was in Bethlehem for a while. So Herod wanted to make sure that he got him. So after a while in their hometown, the Holy Family have to flee to Egypt. Probably not right away because of the time calculations by Herod and his cronies. So what am I saying in all this? While there is some fanfare for the birth of the Messiah, it is not going to be all peaches and roses and rainbows and unicorns. The powerful don't like him. And when the powerful don't like the vulnerable, one way or another, they will seek to snuff them out. And that is the experience of many refugees to this day. It also happens in another less obviously violent way. Sometimes leaders in communities can't cope with dissenting voices. They marginalize certain viewpoints. Or the community itself acts as a kind of policeman stopping or suppressing alternative voices. Maybe that's been your experience. Herod was threatened by an alternative ruler, another way of thinking that would undermine his total power. Jesus became an exile from his hometown and from his own people, God's people. But, says Luke, he continued to grow in his relationship with God. My prayer for each of you who listen to this podcast is that you would likewise grow in your spiritual life, even if you feel like you are separated from the people of God. This space is one of welcome. Let's keep traveling together as the Dechurched.